The computer, there we go. All right, thank you. So I'm going to follow up I'm going to say dizzying set of anecdotes from Orange County with a little bit more systematic analysis, largely based on the other side of the country in Boston. It wasn't meant as a slam, it was just, it was a large set of, this is all the things that go on. I'm going to say, great, you now know all those things go on. And this is what, we can see as the, tangible effects of that. So we've seen substantial price growth, not in all housing markets, but in many housing markets. These are the top 5 metropolitan subdivisions from 1980 to 2004. There's some pretty big percentage increases there. And, I could have put the top 30 up there and they would be all pretty high. And they're in the places that you expect them to be: California, Massachusetts, New York. The question that we want to ask ourselves, though, is, yes, the prices have increased, but why have prices increased? Now, obviously, I'm an economist, so I know one thing. There's a supply curve and a demand curve that intersect. And if I see prices go up, I'm going to ask myself 2 questions. Did demand go up? And did supply decrease? So the first thing I'm going to ask is, was there more demand? Certainly in lots of places, in Orange County, in Boston, in San Francisco, in Seattle, Portland, Manhattan, there's been demand growth for a variety of reasons. But demand growth doesn't have to mean that prices go up. The top graph is Las Vegas. The blue line is prices from 1980 to 2000. The line is flat. We all know that Las Vegas has increased in population faster than any other country or any other metropolitan area except for maybe Phoenix. And I could put Phoenix's graph up there and it would look basically the same. As more people show up and want to live in Phoenix and Las Vegas, they just go out in the desert. They put in a new subdivision, and the red line is the permits. And they build a lot more, and that keeps the price flat. So we go to the bottom and we look at Boston, and it used to be that this was the case in Boston or Manhattan or in a variety of other places. There was lots of building, and there's a little blip. You can see the blue line's going up in the 80s and the red line goes up right with it. Then there was kind of a bust. But then you see the last 6 or 7 years, the blue line starts shooting up a lot, but the red line isn't following it. So this creates a problem for me as an economist. Look, the prices are going up. It's more revenue for those people who enter the market and build more houses. So why aren't they doing it? Why is the red line staying flat? There's 3 reasons why we might expect that supply is not responding to the higher prices. The first is it costs more now to build a house. Maybe the labor cost spiked or the materials cost spiked or whatever. That would cause a supply shift and cause the supply not to respond. Second is that there's just no more land. You think of some place like San Francisco or Manhattan. There's not a whole lot of land. There's physical geographic restrictions. And so maybe they've just, or a place like Boston, people have been living there for, as long as they've been living, for whatever, 400 years now. And maybe they've just kind of built up and they're, we're running out of land. So now if I want to build something new, I got to tear something else down, and that's, making it more expensive to build. And the last thing we'll explore is, maybe it's just regulation that's driving a lot of this. So let's start with the first one. Do higher construction costs explain higher prices? Well, so what I've produced here, and although I could break it down in a lot of different ways and it would tell the same story, is this is the real single-family construction cost over time for kind of a consistent quality house in 177 metropolitan areas across the country. And you can see that while maybe this would have explained price increases that we would have observed in the 60s and the 70s, since then, construction costs have been flat or even declining. And that holds, in Boston, in San Francisco, in Orange County. In San Francisco, I believe that from 70 to 2000 actually increased like maybe 4%. But doing whatever we want to do, maybe this holds this kind of modest quality home. Maybe everybody doesn't want those homes. Maybe prices have increased because we want bigger homes or higher quality homes. Even taking that into account, we can't get very far in explaining the big change in prices in these areas. At most 25% of the increase, and that's not in the areas that I showed at the beginning, like Boston or San Francisco or New York. So the construction cost hypothesis doesn't really get us very far. So the next thing is, have areas run out of land? This one needs to be investigated a little bit more. I can't speak for every municipality, but I can say that I've written a paper which looks at this extensively in Boston. which is where the graph that below is. And what's on this graph is it's the density, so how many houses are sitting in the town per acre in 1980. And on the y-axis here is the total number of permits in the 22 years following that. So what does the little upward sloping thing mean? What it means is that places that were really high density, i.e. that already had a lot of stuff sitting on their land, they actually built a lot more than the communities that didn't have a whole lot of stuff sitting on their land. This is, isn't hard to explain. The places that have the very low density in Massachusetts, kind of the opposite of a lot of the smart growth stuff, is they still have the very large lot zoning. We have lots of places that have 2-acre minimum lot sizes. I grew up in Oregon. My dad is a developer. Oregon, has our urban growth boundaries. And when I first got the data, I was, completely ignorant of, housing markets in Boston. And I got the data, and I'm looking at the minimum lot sizes that are accompanying each town. And it's like 80,000 square feet. And I'm like, well, that's got to be wrong. That can't be, this is a suburb. This is like a town next to Boston. It can't possibly be 80,000 square feet. So I call up my dad. I'm like, is this possible? And he's like, no, it's not possible. He was wrong. It's possible. And so, I could throw up a number of other things that we've analyzed, but the basic conclusion is that, at least in Boston, I can't speak for other areas with as much certainty, the lack of land hypothesis doesn't get us very far. So, is it regulation? Regulations, just from a theoretical perspective, they act like a tax. Those of you who sat through a principles of microeconomics class, or maybe some of you even teach them, you force your students, or you had to learn about, taxation. You tax something, it shifts the supply curve back. Regulations basically do the same thing, but it's a really bad kind of tax, because instead of it being, this is 10%, and I know that if I want to do this, I pay a 10% tax, I don't know what the cost of the tax is, right? I have to navigate the, 20 different boards, and who knows what they're going to complain about, and who knows what the various community members are going to complain about, or what lawsuits are going to get filed. And this creates a lot of uncertainty that makes the inefficiency of the taxes much higher, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Several studies, including one that I've written, which take comparable communities within an area and say, okay, let's take two similar areas, much like the studies that Stephen was discussing, and say, okay, let's look at places that have more regulation and have less regulation, and let's see what happens to their supply response. Unsurprisingly, places with lots of regulations have less permits. In Boston, we find that a quarter-acre increase in average minimum lot size implies 9% fewer houses, existing in 2000, and 10% fewer permits annually between 1980 and 2000. It's not just minimum lot sizes. When you look at the other kinds of regulations, wetlands rules or subdivision rules or septic rules, each one of those things reduces permits between 10 to 20% annually. So there's plenty of evidence that regulation can, unsurprisingly, reduce the supply of housing. And the timing works out as well. It's not just that, okay, we know that regulations matter, but if we want to explain this divergence in recent years, the timing's got to work that, we're now using more regulations. So what should we find? This is, again, for communities in 187 communities in the eastern Massachusetts. And the lines are basically, you don't need to read them very carefully, but they're the fraction of communities that have adopted different forms of regulation. The lines go up. So if we combine the last findings with these findings, it's not hard to say, okay, well, maybe a lot of what's going on in a lot of these communities where we're seeing these really big price increases are regulations have become more popular. Regulations have an effect. And unsurprisingly, when you restrict supply and there's strong demand, prices go up. So this begs the question: well, why is it that we now have all these regulations when we didn't have them before? So the first thing, these are all just hypotheses. These need a lot more research. Is that homeowners, particularly in bedroom communities and suburbs, have become more powerful and better organized. They've decided, okay, if there's something that they don't like, they've figured out how to keep it from happening. So that begs the question, well, why do they not want things to happen? And again, this is just speculation, but there may be more incentives relative to 30 or 40 years ago for homeowners to try and block development. It could be that new developments, for whatever reasons, I'm not sure I've seen evidence of this, but they have bigger negative effects on homeowners' values or the quality of the public services that they think they're going to get. Or it could just be that amenities have become more valuable, such as low density. And so, why, if I value this more, I'm going to spend more of my time and effort trying to do things which I think are going to try and protect it. Another part of it is that, lawsuits may have become more successful because judges, mirroring some of these sentiments, may have become more sympathetic to them and started ruling more in favor of them. And lastly is, kind of the more cynical one is that developers have lost the ability to bribe officials, either legally or illegally. So they, maybe have been weakened there. Some things to think about. This all needs more research, but these are kind of things that have been discussed. So in conclusion, regulations contribute to the unaffordability of housing. When you restrict supply and demand is strong, as an economist, I can almost guarantee you that prices will go up. But I can't speak to any kind of national solutions because ultimately each area has its own set of problems because regulations vary a lot across places. There's no simple solutions. What I can say is that, look, there's some basic things that you have to think about when you're trying to design a regulatory environment. First is you got to make sure that everybody's got the incentives right. It's one of the problems, and I'll discuss this more in the workshop, that you find in eastern Massachusetts is that you have 187 communities packed tightly together. Each community has its own incentives to regulate itself because it doesn't bear the full cost of the effects, right? So I keep everybody out of my community. But it doesn't mean that my community, the price increases actually get spread across the region because we exist in a regional market. So you got to kind of get everybody on the same page. The second thing, as I mentioned, is that a big problem here is uncertainty. A lot of developers, would be fine entering into the market and expanding the supply. If they knew exactly what they had to pay to get it, they would just, pay that as long as the returns were great enough for them to do so. But as is, they don't know what the costs are going to be, and the downside risk that it's going to be really high, drives them out of the market. And last, there are ways to. It's hard to debate that when if I do something to my property, it can have effect on the houses that are adjacent. So there's externalities or spillovers in housing markets. Unfortunately, we have a blunt tool now to try and deal with those, which is I'm going to use laws that were developed to protect the environment or something like this as an instrument to prevent you from doing anything which might threaten me. We can think creatively about ways to better internalize the effect. If you build some a development next to my house and it affects the value of my property, we should be able to negotiate a price, and where I'm going to not force you to spend millions of dollars in a lawsuit, and you're not going to just put in some monstrosity. We come to an agreement, we work out some side payments, but we can think about ways to do this better. So there's lots of solutions, but the main takeaway is that we got to think about how to solve these problems because regulations matter, and particularly in these areas where you're seeing these massive increases in prices, it's hard to deny it's an important part of the explanation for why housing is becoming so unaffordable in these areas. Thank you very much.